Now we'll look at the postcard phase. And basically, that's the period where images that are just so picturesque, so grand and enjoyable looking. Oftentimes, these are images that we would say are meant for a postcard. And that's just, like I said, they're so picturesque and they're so grand and they're so awe inspiring. Here we have an Ansel Adams, Moonrise Hernandez, New Mexico, 1941. As you can see from this image, that the idea of postcard, very picturesque, very awe-inspiring. Ansel Adams, probably a no-brainer for these types of images, and his imagery from the various national parks and stuff. Probably talked a little bit before about Ansel Adams before, and how he would spend weeks, sometimes months at a time, out in the wilderness, out in these parks, out in these locations to do his photographs. Oftentimes, he might take 2 or 3 days before he finally takes his photograph. Sort of, what's going to be the best lighting, what's going to really sort of create this awe-inspiring moment. And so here we have, the moonrise coming up over this, desert type plain. Here we have Ansel Adams' Grand Tetons at the Snake River. And again, just sort of the majesticness of the landscape that he's trying to capture, the beauty of it all. This is, not too terribly long after we start to get our national parks and the further expansion westward and things that are open to us by now. And, really looking at what we have, these natural wonders that we have. Here's one is Half Dome at Yosemite. Again, just very majestic and awe-inspiring and wanting to be out there in nature and seeing what all is out there in our country, in our parks, what we can go and enjoy. Sort of opposite that in a way is Edward Winston. Edward Winston, if you remember when we talked about Alfred Stieglitz and his cloud pictures, they're more about these lines and shapes. So Edward Winston is more about what's sometimes referred to as abstract photography. He's more concerned with the shape of things and the appearance of things. Obviously, wanting to have a good photograph, a good contrast, and good balance of light and all of that. But at the same time, as we can see, the one image of the female model that's kind of bending over, holding her knee. How does she compare to some of these other images? Even though she's a female, we don't really get the human form from her in a way. It's kind of mimicking some of these other forms of the seashells and the pepper and the tree. So he becomes more interested in these lines and shapes and overall forms rather than having a image that is completely recognizable. So here's Dunes at Oceano, 1936. Again, much more abstract, the shadows creating this lines and shapes, the dunes creating these different sort of lines and the visual textures that we're getting from this image. While yes, it's a photograph, it's not always about photographing something that's recognizable. Like I said before, like the Alfred Stieglitz and his cloud photos and getting into this idea of abstraction, the abstracted image, the abstracted form. These are some of the things to think about with some of Winston's photos. In this particular one, it's kind of an ironic, humorous take on the the landscape. The hot coffee, the Mojave Desert. The idea of drinking hot coffee in a desert, kind of ridiculous in a way. At the same time, when we get into this idea of the landscape and what do humans do to the landscape? What are we doing? What's going on here? Is it just a landscape? What is this giant coffee cup doing in the landscape? Talked about this a little bit in the last lecture of, the human element coming into the landscape. So Winston showing a giant man-made coffee cup within the landscape of this desert. And again, sort of the same thing. Quaker State Oil, Arizona, 1941. Here we have this beautiful desert landscape with the man-made objects in it, this highway going through, as well as you can see the drainage pipes and the sign. Man is entering the landscape. As we are pushing our country further west, we're leaving traces of ourselves. Unlike the Ansel Adams trying to eliminate us from the landscape, here we have Winston, showing that we are part of the landscape. We're taking over the landscape. And now Ed Rasha, in some of his books, typically you could make this blanket statement on Ed Rasha and his love affair with the... Here in this Ed Rasha 26 gas station, 1963, you could make a blanket statement about Ed Rasha and his sort of love affair with the gas station. As America, post-war America, expanding into the West, our roadways, the highway system are being developed and being built so that our love affair with the cars. And part of that love affair with cars is, well, our cars need gas. So here's this new type of building that's starting to take over the landscape. Ed Rasha capturing all of these various gas stations as we again continue to put these man-made objects, these man-made way of changing the landscape, becoming this familiar image within a landscape of the gas station, going all across the country. Ed Rasha going along and documenting and showing the ways that we are putting our take on landscape and putting ourselves into the landscape with all of these gas stations. And as well as just, urbanization as well. 50s and 60s where you get the baby boom, as it's called, and families are moving out into the suburbs, the expanding suburbs that start to happen. So again, the changing of the landscape. And Ed Rasha, every building on Sunset Strip, recording this strip from its beginning to the end. Where does this Sunset Strip start? Where does the Sunset Strip end? What is all along the Sunset Strip? So these are the things that Ed Rasha is recording and putting in his little fold-out books. And the new topographics artists or photographers, again, they're looking at this new idea of the landscape. Kind of like Winston in a way, humans are coming into the landscape. What are we adding to the landscape? What are we doing to the landscape? And sort of their look on the modern day landscape as humans are coming into and expanding these new different areas. We're taking over larger areas with urbanization, suburban sprawl. An example of what would normally be kind of this nice picturesque view of the little foothills in the background. Now it's being dominated by houses and construction, something that we're a little more familiar with seeing, as these new neighborhoods go in, not too far from us. So the urbanization or the man-made additions to the landscape. Such as the Bernard and Hilla Becker, their photographs of these spherical tanks. And again, it's sort of this idea that man is coming in, man is taking over the landscape. And this is becoming the new landscape. This is becoming the way the landscape will be seen from now on, by having these gigantic storage tanks that we see all over. Much like seeing all the water towers, when you're up on a hill looking over a valley or of some sort where there's all kinds of neighborhoods and you see all these water towers all over the place. That's becoming part of the landscape now. It's no longer the picturesque beauty of the Ansel Adams or the O'Sullivans that we looked at before. Here, Frank Galt, landscape, beautiful mountains, the beautiful foothills of Los Angeles, but how would we know if they're beautiful or not? Because of our view being blocked by the buildings. So that man interfering with the landscape. We no longer have beautiful landscapes anymore. We have all this concrete and asphalt and all these man-made things that are coming and taking over. We're losing the picturesque quality of the landscape. Robert Adams, Mobile Homes, Jefferson County, Colorado. Again, this should be this beautiful picturesque valley, but this valley is just kind of full of homes. This expanding suburban sprawl, this new community that's come and taken over the area. It should be beautiful and picturesque. Maybe if you're a land developer, it's beautiful and picturesque. You can brag about the new development that you have put in. Maybe it's a new type of beauty, the new way to look at the landscape. It's full of homes and roads and streets. Some at the Lewis Baltz. Again, man is coming in, man is taking over. Although here is kind of an interesting take because we see the inside of the building. It's sort of the inside and the outside. The outside still a little bit picturesque. It's still kind of a bit of a view to see, but part of the view is blocked by this building and what's inside the building. It's almost like nothing inside this building. We have a ladder and just sort of this empty space and just not a whole lot going on. I mean, it's kind of the opposite of the awe-inspiring. It's just sort of dull, boring. What are we doing to the landscape? Joe Dill, Untitled View, Albuquerque, 1974. Again, sort of the same thing. We should have this beautiful type of landscape photo of the desert, but it's filled with homes. This is becoming the new landscape. This is what we're used to seeing. This is our everyday. Uh, Henry Wessel Jr., Las Vegas, 1973. Las Vegas, kind of an interesting town in a way when you think about it. We start asking, what do we think of Las Vegas? What comes to mind? Casinos, the strips, and all the glitz and glamours and the lights. And here we don't necessarily have that in a way. It's the other sort of Las Vegas that we don't really think about. The everyday Las Vegas. Where do people live? Where do people go? I mean, it's not like this weird magical land where the people who work in all the glitzy, glamorous places, they have to go somewhere. They have to live. They have to have their sort of daily doings in different places that they go to. So Wessel showing us that other side of Las Vegas. Here in the Stephen Shore photo, what's the ironic thing going on here? Well, you're going out to experience the landscape, experience the beauty, but you can't because there's a giant billboard in the way. And that's becoming the new way we see the landscape. We have to look at pictures. We can't go out and experience it like we used to because man is getting in the way, man is interfering. So if I want to experience the great outdoors, the grandeur, and all of what Ansel Adams was showing me I could go enjoy, I can go look at a billboard to do that. I don't necessarily have to trek somewhere far. And even if I was to try to trek somewhere, basically the statement that man's going to get in your way. All this man-made stuff is in the way, and it's interfering with the landscape. Another one of Stephen Shore's. Again, the hills in the background, but it's full of all this stuff put in the way by man. So it's kind of hard to enjoy it when there's so much man-made stuff. And you could say it's kind of a nod to Ed Rasha because in this image we have it full of gas stations. It's sort of Ed Rasha sort of glorifying the gas station in a way. You could say Stephen Shore is sort of doing the opposite, where the gas stations are in the way of the landscape. They're interfering with the landscape, where Ed Rasha is the gas station's part of the landscape. And here we have the Andrei Gortsky, the Rhine. Again, we're getting into kind of the Winston abstract. It's more about, in this case, these lines going across the photo. It's kind of bleak and dismal. Is this really that picturesque? Or maybe for some it is picturesque. It's the calm, quiet place. Nothing is going on. I can just sit here, look at the river, and sort of be in the quiet, happy place, away from the hustle and bustle and the craziness of what we just saw in the Stephen Shore with all the gas stations and the busy. Finally we can get out and enjoy kind of the nothingness that is there. So kind of going back to, in a way, the Ansel Adams, the quiet tranquilness. So next we'll look at photography as photographers leaving the studio that leave for war and political uprising.